Hello, lovely listeners. I am back with the second episode of Thalassophobia. As I said in the first video, the summary of the story will be in the description box from now on, so if you need a refresher on the plot, feel free to check it out. Now, without further ado. Part 1. Echoes of the Past. My beloved daughter. The voice of Morel's father, Nelu, called to her from something that was not quite a dream, but not quite a memory either. You are destined for great things. Morel, only 10 at the time, was barely paying attention to his words as she was far too distracted by the sight of his blood splattering against the snow. She was trying hard not to let her eyes drift to her mother's body, which had gone disturbingly still, that was only a few feet behind her father. Morel could hear the crunching footsteps of the men that were chasing them and see them in the distance. Despite his predicament, her father was giving her that stupid, bright smile that was in most of her memories containing him. But father, Morel cried. She reached for him, aiming for the wound that was gushing on the left side of his chest. Another gunshot pierced the air. Morel jolted awake, panting and shivered from the memory of the biting weather. She scuttled around on the floor with her hands, grounding herself with the feel of its wood. It was only the soft breathing on the other side of the cabin that made the fog in her head clear and made the events of last night come flooding back to her. When Morel had told the human that she was the wolf from the stories, the reaction she had gotten started off as genuine surprise before transitioning into one that could only be described as muted skepticism. Am I not what you were expecting? Morel asked, amused at the look on her face. Well, the stories make you out to be this snarling, menacing beast with sharp teeth and drool dripping from your jowls. There was a pause as the human took a second to look at her. And bigger. Sorry to disappoint you. I'm not. The human rushed to reassure, as if Morel would be offended over what she thought of her. It's just, you're not that scary. Those stories you've read were written 16 years ago. You think you can gauge what I was like back then. So, you used to be a huge drooling monster. I absolutely did not drool. When the human started to chuckle, Morel realized she had probably sounded like an indignant child. Despite knowing that the prickle of heat that settled in her cheeks had nothing to do with the fire, she turned her attention to it anyway. It was putting up a brave battle against the winds that were thudding against the cabin door and slithering in through the cracks. The winds whistled and whipped at the flames, which caused them to skimper and send ash into the air. The emitting light cast an illumination on the human's face that gave away the fact she was lost in thought. Sorry, she said after realizing that she had let silence hang in the air. I'm just coming to terms with everything being true. I've read about everything. About you, but I thought it was exaggerated. A ploy to make Reveldad seem special to tourists. I never imagined that it was true. She looked up then. Their eyes met, and Morel's heart gave an uncomfortable lurch due to the fact that the human was looking at her with an expression that was alive with wonderment and intrigue. Do you always stare like that? Morel snapped. The human made a startled sort of movement and once again dropped her gaze. It took a second, but the tiniest inkling of guilt began to prickle in Morel's gut. For what it's worth, some of it is definitely exaggerated. For instance, she offered the tiniest upturn of her lips. The drool. The human smiled, and the atmosphere in the cabin got a little warmer. But you really can't die? She asked. For the most part. Not even of old age. Morel had considered this question before. She really didn't know, and told the human so. She, once again, sat and considered this while making a contemplative sound. Morel couldn't help but be amused. She had never seen anybody be so expressive while thinking. It was entertaining watching her eyes go back and forth over the table, silently mumbling to herself while making sense of everything she had just been told. The human lowered her head to begin picking at her food with a knife and fork that Morel had lent her. Morel herself had forgone the knife and fork and was using her hands to tear her fish apart. For the rice, she used a spoon. It seemed as though the answer to her question from earlier regarding if the human was prone to staring was an uncontested yes. Morel could feel her eyes timidly traveling her skin. They looked at her claws, golden eyes, and, whenever she opened her mouth for food, her sharp teeth. She wondered what was going through the woman's mind. Was she frightened? Was the intrigue on her face the result of wondering how likely it was for Morel to hurt her? Was she going to make an excuse to leave the cabin? With such a line of thought as this, it was a genuine surprise when she cleared her throat and simply asked for a glass of water. Morel hoped that the human didn't notice the unceremonious way her seat skidded as she rose to go fetch one of the jugs she kept water in, along with 2 tall glasses from one of her shelves. When she went to place the drinks on either side of the table, she glanced at the human's face and saw that there was no fear there at all. It was only when the two drank that either of them spoke again. "What?" Morel asked, her ears prickling at the sound of the human starting into her glass. "Nothing." She used her sleeve to wipe the water going down her chin. "It's just that I was wondering if you're going to lap the water with your tongue." Morel raised an eyebrow at her. "That is to say, you act so human," the woman continued, and Morel got the feeling that she, once again, worried she had been offensive. "Inviting me to dinner, letting me spend the night? Not what I expected after reading about you. Honestly, I thought you would scare me." With a slightly awkward look, she went back to picking at her food, which had undoubtedly gone cold by now. Morel drew back in her seat and regarded her with narrowed eyes. She couldn't remember the last time a human was calm enough to eat in her presence. Was it when she was an adolescent? No, that didn't count. She hadn't really been herself during that time. It must have been when she was a child. It was certainly long enough ago that she couldn't believe that she had a human guest right now. Her thoughts were interrupted when the woman spoke again. "Have you ever tried killing yourself?" She looked as though she had discovered an interesting hypothesis. Morel would be lying if she said that she wasn't highly amused at the look on the human's face as she came to the slow realization that asking someone if they had tried to commit suicide was actually a deeply personal question that wasn't usually asked during first meetings. "Yes," Morel replied, unbothered. "It doesn't work. As far as I'm aware, Krona is the only person on Earth with the power to kill me." It was her turn to return to her meal. It had, in fact, gone cold, but it was still a welcome feeling in Morel's stomach. A much less pleasant feeling was the human's eyes on her, watching her closely. "You experience hunger," she said in a voice like she was regarding something that was fascinating. "So you can feel things like pain and discomfort." Morel glanced up at her, only slightly interested in where she was going with this. "Yes," she said. "So, when you were in the ocean for a year, you—" Morel clenched her hands so hard that her claws pierced the table. "I'm exhausted," she said, and rose from her seat to go put out the fire pit. "Oh, all right." The human sounded startled. "Good night, then." "Good night." Morel retreated to her bed and got comfortable underneath its blanket while the human took up the endeavor of trying to make herself comfortable at the table. Surprisingly enough, this did not seem to be going well. She scraped her chair back to give herself enough room to comfortably lean forward and place her head on top of her folded arms. She turned this way and that, trying to angle herself into a position that made the effects of sleeping in a wooden chair less palpable. Morel couldn't have lasted more than 2 minutes before growing agitated enough to insist that the human take her bed. This was met with protests, but Morel was already in the process of kicking her blanket off. She said that neither of them would get any sleep with the human acting like a newborn deer on a frozen lake, and this seemed to put an end to the complaints. Morel made her way to the door, where she sat with her back pressed against it and wasted no time shutting her eyes to settle down for sleep. She could hear her guest take uncertain steps towards the bed and the slight rustling sound of her getting comfortable under the blanket. "Oh." She yawned, her tone like she had just remembered something. "My name is Vitala Ston, by the way." Morel made a gruff sound of acknowledgement, but honestly didn't care. Soon enough, shallow breathing filled the cabin and both inhabitants fell asleep. It was morning now, and the human showed no signs of waking. Morel stood to her feet and greeted the morning with a grand stretch. The daylight mousing through the door was unpleasant on her eyes, but she simply used her hand for shade and stumbled outside. The human had left her mare outside the cabin last night, and it lay curled up on one of the flatter spots of the hill. At the sound of the door opening, it flicked its ears and chuffed, but was otherwise unbothered by Morel walking to the edge of the hill to peek out at the town of Reveldad, which was just barely visible from her position and was bathed in the hue of the sunrise. Morel wondered what the humans would be doing right now. She imagined some of them would be rousing their children for the morning chores of milking cows or gathering eggs. Some would be enjoying the dawn by way of having breakfast with their spouses outside. Others would be taking down their laundry from where they had left them to dry overnight. Morel's musings were interrupted by the sound of rustling and sniffing coming from behind her. She had almost forgotten about the human's annoying dog as he shook himself free of his resting place in one of the pouches connected to the horse's saddle and bounded over towards her while screeching the word wolf. Morel curled her lip in displeasure. I don't know how she stands you, loud as you are. The dog said something about the human being his friend. Friend? Morel barked. How can you be friends with someone who has the power to put a collar around your neck? The dog said something about how he loved the human and wouldn't subject himself to her care if he didn't. He talked about how he had met dogs who had chosen to go feral due to abusive owners, and how he would have joined them if he found his human to be unkind. Morel did not believe his rationale for a second. I bet those feral dogs scared you out of your skin. I bet you've never gone a single day without 3 meals and a couple of treats to boot. He let out an embarrassed sort of snort that told Morel she was right and he didn't like that she was. He barked something about being able to tell Morel was dangerous and not normal, and how he'd protect the human with his life, so she had better not try anything. So you feel all of that towards me and yet still allowed me to get her all alone in my cabin while you slept out here? The dog stopped hopping around, his feeling of embarrassment apparently increasing until it rendered him silent. Morel let him sit with his feelings for a few more moments before saying, Don't worry yourself. I have no interest in harming her. With that, she went back to surveying the town, walking ever closer to the edge of the hill. The sun had fully risen by now, and the sky had no clouds to offer. Some of the humans would be getting ready to set up their shops. Morel, now thinking of the old saleswoman, would only be half aware of the fact that the dog had taken a seat 2 feet behind her and was watching her closely. She didn't care enough to ponder what was going through his mind, but he was wondering what was going through hers. Specifically, why her demeanor had gone from so cold and callous to pensive and melancholy in a matter of moments. Morel would eventually turn around, her attention caught by what sounded like the human getting out of bed, to find him looking at her. A low, contemplative whine left him as their eyes met. He asked her a simple question. Are you bad? Morel got an awful chill. Before she could respond, the door to her cabin opened and the human walked out looking ready for the day, which was remarkable considering she was wearing the same thing she had worn to bed. She saw her dog first, and his tail started wagging the literal second her eyes were on him. She beamed at him and dropped to a crouch. This was enough to make him abandon all interest in Morel as he sprinted to his owner with his sad excuse for a tail wagging the entire way. He put his front paws on her knee and began hopping on his hind legs to lick her face. Did you sleep well, Porcupine? She cooed, in that voice humans adopted when speaking to animals who couldn't understand them. Her hands were on either side of his head, ruffling his pointy ears. I bet you're happy you no longer have to spend days riding on Willow. The dog was too busy licking her face to say anything. She pulled a treat out of her pocket and tried to feed it to him, but his eyes drifted to Morel and he turned it down. Morel snorted. The human looked puzzled about her dog's rejection, but did not say anything. She rose to her feet and looked at Morel with a smile that took her by surprise. Good morning, Morel, she greeted. Good morning, Morel responded. Thank you again for letting me stay. I would love to repay you one day if you let me. What did you call that dog? Oh, his name is Porkchop, but I call him all sorts of different things like Porcupine and... She suddenly looked as though she found the rest of the names too embarrassing to say out loud. She cleared her throat, a bit of red on her cheeks, and said, Before I forget, I was wondering if you have any recommendations on where I should visit. You're better off asking a human, Morel said. My view of Reveldad is based entirely on the places that will allow demons in. Not helpful for a woman. Oh, I disagree, she said. I would love to meet Reveldadians who welcome demons. Sleep had made Morel forget how sincere the human was. Her memories of last night were nothing compared to experiencing it again. Well, there's an old woman who sells various types of meat. She stands out since she's older than most other shopkeepers. The man who runs the bar called Drinks for Any Mix is popular. I don't know if I'd exactly call him nice, but he definitely knows how to get all manner of creatures drunk. Will let anyone hang around so long as they pay. That's about it. That's it? The human blinked, cocking her head slightly. Only 2? I told you it'd be unhelpful for a human, Morel said. I'm afraid that the people of Reveldad don't want me or my kind hanging around. So why do you stay? Morel frowned at her. It was much too early to deal with another round of questions. Thankfully, the human took the hint and turned somewhat awkwardly to go and rouse her horse. After getting all of her affairs in order, she gave one last round of thanks to Morel and descended down the hill with her mare's reins in her hands and her dog bounding happily beside her. Privately, Morel wondered how long that intrigued tone of hers would last before it turned to one of disdain and fear born from residing with the people of Reveldad. Part 2. The Imp. Vitala was excited to explore the town of Reveldad with the energy of a good night's sleep. She was sure not to be too noisy when traversing the forest path that led to the town, and sure enough, there was no sword between her eyes when she arrived. Due to the fact that it was just past sunrise, the town was not yet filled with people. In fact, half of the shops had not even been open yet, and the other half looked like they had only just opened, with the shopkeepers rearranging their merchandise to look as neat and appealing as possible. There were a few people who crowded around the almost open shops, apparently waiting for them to fully open. Vitala caught one woman mumbling about how sometimes the best merchandise was only available at certain times in the morning before it either spoiled or was completely bought, and how this morning she would definitely be able to buy something that Vitala did not catch the name of because at that moment she noticed Krona standing a little ways ahead of her, speaking to a woman who looked about her age and seemed rather flustered. Vitala tied Willow to a spike in the ground, between 2 shopping stands that were both selling colorful fruit that seemed to be there for that very purpose. She approached Krona, Porkchop right at her heels, and stopped a polite distance away so as not to interrupt her conversation, but to let her know she'd like to speak to her. Krona, who was in the middle of flexing her bicep, looked at her, smiled, and then turned back to her companion. The woman, who was using her slender fingers to trail and squeeze the curve of her muscle, looked displeased at Vitala's arrival. She scowled, but after a few placating words from Krona, left the 2 alone to talk. "Good morning, Vitala," Krona said in an enthusiastic voice that was accompanied by a dazzling smile. "Good morning," Vitala said, looking amusedly after the woman who had just walked off. Krona turned her head to follow her gaze, then turned back to Vitala with a smile that, while cocky, managed to be endearing all the same. "Being a hero has its benefits," she said. "So I see." Vitala raised her eyebrows. She couldn't believe that Krona would flirt with another woman in broad daylight. She looked around to see if anyone was staring at them, but found that the people that were looking at them were doing so in order to smile fondly at Krona. For the first time since her arrival, Vitala got a genuine sense of how far from the south she truly was. "I can't say I envy you, though," she continued. "I'd imagine all of that admiration is a lot to handle. If you're a fraud, maybe, but I'm not." Her face suddenly changed into something more serious. Her eyes darkened, and her lips creased as if she had just heard something offensive. "I defeated that wolf once, and I will kill her once and for all when the time comes." Vitala was so taken aback by this that she physically flinched. She had forgotten that Krona and Morel were planning on killing each other. Even still, someone openly admitting to wanting to commit murder was not something she was used to. Deep down, she knew that Morel was a wolf and not a woman, so talk of her death shouldn't be met with the same repulsion as human death would. But she couldn't help feeling bad when she considered the scrawny demon against the finely muscled Krona. It seemed like the winner was already clear. "How will you know when the time comes?" she ventured. "Well, she's been laying low for a number of years now, but monsters always slip up. If she kills another human again, then I'll finish what I started 16 years ago." "Why didn't you kill her back then?" Krona got a look on her face like she was recalling the memory. Don't you think that being imprisoned in the ocean for a year is a worse punishment? Vitala nodded, but thought that this was not much of an answer. She wondered what Krona was thinking about. What had happened between Krona and Morel in the moments leading up to her being thrown in the ocean? Aren't you scared that she could win? Vitala asked. Have you seen her? Demon strength can't make up for the fact that the damn dog is pathetic. Vitala frowned, feeling like that was unnecessarily mean. Krona noticed her expression and cocked her head in what seemed to be confusion. Vitala, realizing it probably wasn't common, nor would it be particularly wise, to show sympathy for Morel in front of her current company, stammered out, Can't say I blame her. I'd be scared to fight against those muscles as well. Krona smirked. Staring at them, are you? No! Vitala's face went hot. Krona let out a bubbly laugh that did absolutely nothing to ease the heat in Vitala's cheeks. Looks like your horse has a fan. Krona lifted one finger and pointed it in, assumedly, the direction of Willow. Sure enough, when Vitala turned to look, her horse had captured the attention of a little boy with chestnut skin, shortly cropped wavy hair, and loose clothing. He was standing at Willow's side, stretching up on his toes to get a good look at her. Willow's head was slightly angled in his direction, but was otherwise unbothered as she chewed the little grass that the dusty path of the town had to offer. No way! The boy was saying, his voice alight with excitement. You're a southern breed. What are you doing here? You must have had a long journey, Mr. Horse. Actually, it's Miss Horse. The boy whipped around with wide, light brown eyes to see Vitala approaching him. Willow is a girl horse, she explained, gesturing at Willow with a smile on her face. Did you know those are called mares? The boy bounced on his toes, his excitement not faltering for a single second. Vitala chuckled, feeling instantly fond of him. Do you like horses? He did not directly answer her, but his eyes went wide and he made a high-pitched squeal. He opened his mouth to say something, but then his demeanor changed as he appeared to get sidetracked. With a head cocked to the side, he asked, How come you're squinting your eyes like that? Actually, I was born like this. Can you see? Perfectly well. Oh! His attention turned back to Willow then. I've only ever read about these horsies. They only live far away. How come you have one? I'm also from far away. Willow and I are from the same place. So you're from the south, just like her? It was Vitala's turn for her eyes to go wide in delighted surprise. She couldn't believe how knowledgeable he was at such a young age. Before she could answer him, though, a man's voice cut through the air. Elias. Vitala turned to see a tall man with skin the shade of the boy's running towards them. He had a slightly curled mustache and hair that looked like it had been neat before he hightailed it over to them. When he came to a stop, he hunched over and began gasping for breath with his hands on his knees. You know you shouldn't just run away like that. He heaved with exasperation. I turned around and I was sick with worry thinking I had lost you. But Pa! The boy, Elias, said with an excited expression that was undeterred by his father's stress. This lady has a horse from the south. Isn't that cool? From his hunched position, he looked up at Vitala, then at Willow, and a resigned and understanding look crossed his face as he stood to his full height. Thankfully, he did not seem to be upset. I'm truly sorry if he bothered you, he said, and he certainly looked apologetic as he faced Vitala. Not at all, Vitala insisted. Your son is very bright. Before the man could say anything else, his eyes drifted to something behind Vitala that made his gaze soften. She turned to see a much darker man with tightly coiled hair striding towards them. Perhaps it was an odd thing to describe a man as gorgeous or pretty, but this one definitely was. He was tall, taller even than Elias's father, and Vitala couldn't describe it, but there was something about him that made a calm feeling settle over her. Perhaps it was the fact that there was a naturally serene energy radiating off of him. She smiled at him, and he smiled back before turning to look at Elias's father, Elias, and then Willow. Just like with Elias's father, a look of understanding appeared on his face, though he seemed much more amused. "Oh dear," he said. "I see my son has taken an interest in your horse, ma'am. I do hope he didn't bother you." Vitala was slightly taken aback to hear this man refer to Elias as his son, especially since they were clearly not of the same race and the first man was almost a spitting image of Elias. She recovered quickly and told him that she was not bothered at all. At this, he turned to the first man and said, "Matthias, I thought you were going shopping." His eyes traveled down to Matthias's hands that didn't have so much as a freshly bought apple in sight. "I was in the middle of it, but Elias decided to pull a disappearing act," Matthias said. "I left everything in a panic to find him. I'm going to have to go back." Elias piped up then. "Pa, don't forget to buy medicine for Arrow." His father looked exhausted. "Elias, I've already told you I don't know what's wrong with her, and I simply can't go spending money on random remedies hoping it makes her feel better." "We have to try something," Elias wailed, piercing his father with a gaze that was both grief-stricken and angry. "Are you sure we can't give her some of the medicine you gave me when I was sick?" "Human medicine won't work on a horse. It'll probably make her worse, if anything." "What's wrong with your horse?" Vitala asked. "She's been sick for a couple weeks," Matthias said, his tired eyes sliding over to her. "Has she seen a vet?" Matthias averted her gaze, and Vitala got the feeling that he would have preferred if she hadn't asked that. The other man looked at him, smiled gently, and then turned to Vitala to say, "Miss, if you don't mind me asking, how do you keep your horse so healthy? I've never seen one with such a glistening coat." He reached out to pat Willow, who seemed to enjoy the touch. "Oh, well, I read all I could about proper care of horses before getting Willow. Common illnesses, proper diet, things to watch out for. My family couldn't afford constant veterinary visits, so I figured I may as well prevent the need for them as best I could." It was this last sentence that made Matthias appear more at ease. He looked at Vitala with a tiny smile on his lips, and a brief moment of connection passed between them. She continued, "I was even able to cure her when one of her hooves got infected. Honestly, if you'd like, I could take a look at your horse for you." Elias beamed and turned to the darker man, apparently no longer interested in appealing to his father. The man, however, was looking at Matthias. "What do you think?" he asked. "I'm okay with it, but I still need to finish shopping," Matthias murmured. "Do you want to head back with them while I do that?" The dark-skinned man nodded and then turned to Vitala. "My name is Saren, by the way. Forgive me for not introducing myself earlier." "I'm Vitala Ston," she said, realizing she had not introduced herself to any of them. "It's nice to meet you," Saren said, his expression warm as ever. "Likewise." Saren and Matthias took a moment to speak to each other about what exactly was going to happen. Matthias said he shouldn't be long on account of the fact that he had gathered most of his groceries in a basket, which he had left in the possession of a very confused salesman, and simply needed to finish grabbing a few more things. Saren suggested waiting for him, but he insisted that they should head back without him. After begging Elias to stay within sight of Saren, Matthias waved to the group and walked off down the line of stands. "Miss Stone," Saren said, "is there anything you wanted to do before leaving?" "Nothing important," Vitala said. She hadn't really had much of a plan. Just to get more acquainted with the town, but she supposed she could do that any day. Saren opened his mouth to speak, when, suddenly, a shout pierced the air along with the sound of a door slamming open. Vitala turned to see a man rushing out from a shop. He was chasing and... Vitala's eyes widened as she realized that the creature was an imp. It was a short, gray, wrinkled thing with wings, and what appeared to be claw marks starting from its left ear going all the way down to its chin in a parallel fashion. It flew haphazardly for a moment or two before falling onto the ground, a small dust cloud accompanying the impact. "You damn devil!" The shopkeeper was hollering, his face red and his mustache dampened with sweat. "How dare you enter my shop!" He started whacking the downed creature with his broom. They were hard, thudding hits. The imp was not making any sound, and Vitala wondered if perhaps it had fallen unconscious. She looked around the town and saw that the scene had gathered a large amount of attention. Some looked displeased, others looked indifferent, while others seemed to take pleasure in the sight. None of them did anything. Vitala felt sick as the beating continued. One particularly hard blow caused blood to splash into the air. Vitala wanted to do something, but the shock of bearing witness to such a thing, and the fact that nobody else looked like they were even considering stepping in, made her feel rooted to the spot, watching in horror as the little creature seemed moments away from being beaten to death. "Stop!" a familiar voice called out. Vitala turned to see Morel rushing through the town, sounds of alarm accompanying her arrival. The shopkeeper yelped and stumbled backwards as Morel dropped to the imp's side. She picked up its little body and cradled it in her arms. For a few moments, she did nothing but feverishly scan it, seemingly looking at how bad the damage was. She pressed her ear to its chest and took a second to listen. Vitala guessed that the creature had to be alive since Morel's shoulders dropped in relief. This relief was short-lived, however, as the next thing she did was whip around to face the man holding the broom and bared her teeth with an audible groan. It's its own damn fault," said the shopkeeper, though the anger in his voice made way for unease under Morel's gaze. "He shouldn't have been in there. That doesn't mean you get to beat him half to death," Morel said in a voice that cracked in the way that voices do when someone is about to cry from anger. Vitala felt her heart give a nasty lurch. The man backed ever further away, the unease on his face transitioning to one of near panic. He did not look around for support. He did not dare take his eyes off Morel. She got to her feet, the imp swaying limply in her arms, and made a move towards him before something to her right caused her to snap her head to face it. It was Krona. So far, Vitala's impression of Krona was a favorable one. Yes, she was slightly vain and maybe even arrogant, but she had thus far come across as good-natured. Sure, it had been a little off-putting when she spoke of killing Morel so casually. And yes, she had been rather scary when she greeted Vitala by way of putting a sword right between her eyes. But now? If Krona, at that very moment, was the first impression Vitala ever got of her, she would have thought that this was the creature that Reveldad feared the most. Her eyes bore into Morel with so much intensity that Vitala was unnerved by it despite only being in her peripheral. It was like she was daring her to make a move. Krona's body was slightly angled forward, the muscles in her shoulders rippling as if she was ready to pounce at any moment. Vitala was strongly reminded of a lioness that was watching its prey from the thrush. Krona's face held no kindness, no sympathy. She did not seem to care about the fact that the imp was a bloody mess, nor did she spare a single reproachful look at the shopkeeper who was holding the broom. It was any wonder that Morel did not immediately buckle under that gaze. Oh no, she was gazing back with a look of utmost loathing on her face. The town seemed to be heartened by Krona's presence. A few people jeered at Morel, but the blood pumping in Vitala's ears made it difficult to figure out exactly what they were saying. Morel dropped her gaze first, an air of defeat about her, and took a noticeably deep breath. With the imp still swinging in her arms, she turned and walked back in the direction she had come. The sound of Elias's voice brought Vitala out of her trance. "Can we go now?" The little boy just managed to escape whimpering. He had clutched onto Saren's arm and had his face pressed into it with his eyes closed tight. "Yes, beloved," Saren said in a soft tone. He looked at Vitala. She gave a shaky, troubled nod. Part 3. Matthias and Saren. "I take it you're not from around here." Vitala was startled by Saren's voice. "Is it really that obvious?" she asked, though perhaps being a stranger to this place was not as bad as she would have thought just 2 days ago. "You've been silent since what happened in the town square. That certainly has some implications," he said with a bit of humor in his voice. "Are you saying that's commonplace?" That sick feeling from earlier reared its head again. "Well, demons tend to avoid the town square for that very reason. It's odd that Foggin was there at all." "Foggin?" "That's the imp's name. He was Morel's biggest ally during her reign, so I can't imagine why he, especially, would show his face in broad daylight. Is that why the shopkeeper beat him like that? No, Saren said. Fagen was beaten for being a demon. Though I suppose being Morel's biggest ally made the shopkeeper's hand come down a little heavier. Vitala contemplated this in silence. Eventually, Saren stopped walking, and Vitala looked up to see a one-story, but rather wide, brown house that was surrounded by a white fence that the tip of what seemed to be a shed was visible from. The closest neighboring residence was hardly more than a spot in the distance. It's not much, Saren said. I think it's lovely. The house was not much different from that of Vitala's father. Seeing it put a much-needed smile on her face. Just then, a teenage girl came out from the door of the fence. Elias ran up to her and wrapped his tiny little arms around her waist while standing on his tippy toes. The girl put her hands on his shoulders and smiled down at him. She looked up at Saren, her smile deepening, but then her eyes went to Vitala and her face dropped to one of confusion. She looked at Saren again with the unasked question in her eyes. This is Vitala Ston, he said, stepping aside and gesturing. He looked at the aforementioned woman then. Miss Stone, my daughter, Josephine. It was clear that Josephine was his daughter in the same way Elias was his son. She didn't particularly look like Matthias, except maybe her eyes, but she was closer to looking like him than she was to looking anything like Saren. Good morning, Vitala said. It's nice to meet you. Yeah, you too, Josephine said. Elias stepped back from his sister to better look her in the face and resumed his elated bouncing from earlier. Josephine, Vitala is going to fix Arrow. Oh, yeah? She asked, while ruffling the little boy's hair. She looked at Vitala once again, this time her face full of skepticism. Vitala couldn't help but wonder how sick this horse was. The four of them headed back the way Josephine came, until they reached the spacious shed that was big enough to comfortably hold a horse and 3 or 4 grown adults. Arrow, a mare that was completely black, save for a white diamond on her forehead and a singular white cannon, was curled up within it, looking lethargic with a blue blanket placed over her. The poor thing was coughing and had an obviously drippy nose. Vitala, feeling a rush of relief, had a feeling she already knew what was wrong. She knelt down next to Arrow and felt her. Sure enough, the poor thing was running a fever. Has she been eating or drinking? Vitala asked, turning her head around to look at Saren, but keeping one hand on Arrow to pet her. Very little, Saren said. Vitala felt the horse's lymph nodes, and they were enlarged, just as she suspected. How old is she? She asked. 4. And how long has she been like this? About 2 weeks. I'm confident that it's the flu. All the signs are there. It's extremely common in horses, especially at this age, and not deadly. Vitala stood to her feet then, and was glad that she had left Willow outside of the fence. The flu may not be deadly, but it was airborne and highly contagious amongst horses. If it's been 2 weeks, then she's seeing the end of this. Willow got this when she was 3, and it took 3 weeks for her to recover, but she did in the end. Arrow should be perfectly okay. She added this last part to Elias with a smile. She could tell that her words had had quite the calming effect on the family. Saren gave a sigh of relief. Josephine smiled, and Elias looked like he was going to cry. She won't? His voice broke. She won't die? I'm confident not. If you want, I can come by again to check on her. Do you hear that, Elias? Saren reached to pinch his son's cheek. Elias wiped the tears from his cheeks with his shirt, and then looked up with gleaming eyes at his dad before casting a similar look at Vitala and running to wrap his little arms around her waist. Despite being surprised, she awkwardly grasped his shoulder with one hand and used her other to run through his hair, which made him hold her tighter. Elias loves Arrow, Saren said, his expression warm as he gazed down at him. You're probably his favorite person now. Elias suddenly let go and looked up at Vitala with eyes the size of saucers. I have 5 coins I've been saving. You can have them. I don't think she wants your 5 coins, Elias, Josephine said, looking bemused. How about breakfast instead? Saren said with a twinkling smile. I'd hate for you to do us such a big favor and then just send you on your way. Eat with us. Matthias is a lovely cook. It was really no trouble on my... Vitala began. Please? Elias begged, hopping in place once again. Vitala worried at her lip. She didn't feel as though she deserved to be treated so nicely for such a simple diagnosis. She eventually relented when it became clear that they would not, left poor Chuck outside with Willow and followed the family indoors. The inside of the house was filled with a lot of brown. Brown countertops, brown chairs, brown cabinets, and even brown pots. There was a wooden rocking horse and some horse figurines on the floor, which Saren apologized for and quickly tidied. Vitala was drawn to a bookshelf that stood near the dining table. The bottom shelf was comprised of children's books and books about horses. The middle shelf was the emptiest and held what appeared to be fiction books. She recognized one book as being about a romance between a convicted felon and the daughter of the man who put him away, but the others were lost on her. The top shelf was far more up her alley, as it had books focusing on science and books about the anatomy and psychology of various demons. On the same shelf were 6 books that caught her attention. All 6 editions of the works of Jerry Jackson, a scientist who was famous for her work on studying demons. Matthias returned home just as Vitala was longing to take the books off the shelves. He managed to get halfway in the door before Elias bounced up to him to tell him all about the day's happenings. Matthias nodded along at all the appropriate times as he laid out the groceries and began washing what needed to be washed, chopping what needed to be chopped, and seasoning what needed to be seasoned. Before long, mouth-watering aroma started filling the air. If it wasn't made clear by the loud rumble of Vitala's stomach, Elias giggled at this, she was quite glad that she had been convinced to stay for breakfast. Eventually, everything was cooked and put on plates, and they gathered around the circular table in the dining room to enjoy their meal, which consisted of a lovely presentation of things that Vitala had no name for, but looked very good nonetheless. Elias begged to be seated next to her. Would you believe he doesn't usually take to strangers? Matthias jested as he took a seat next to Saren, who had Josephine on the other side of him. Really? Vitala asked. To be fair, you having a horse saved you the brunt of the work in terms of making him like you, Saren added. Not just any horse, Dad, Elias said. A horse from the south. Is that where you're from, Miss Stone? Saren asked. Yes. Trakova, to be specific. I am unfamiliar. I know a girl from there, Josephine piped up. You guys are known for your warriors, right? That's right, Vitala confirmed. Is that why you have a horse? Elias tilted his head. To ride into battle? Vitala smiled at him. No, I'm not the warrior type, even if they did allow women to be warriors over there. I much prefer science and learning. What brings you all the way up to Reveldad? Matthias asked. Because I found the things people wrote about this place to be fascinating. Even if I did think it was greatly exaggerated, I loved reading first-hand accounts of Reveldadians. Demons don't really exist in the South, you see. I've only seen about 6 in my entire time living there. Really? Josephine interjected, looking disbelieving. We say demons all the time. There was a small little rat demon in the backyard when we went to check on Arrow earlier, actually. Was there? Vitala asked, feeling very disappointed that she hadn't noticed. I guess demons don't like the southern weather. Actually, it's because of the wolf, Matthias said, his words slightly stifled from the bit of food in his mouth. The prophecy stated that she'd be born in ice, and if anyone is going to have weather that can be described as ice, it's definitely us northern folk. Morale completely changed demon behavior. Saren reinforced. It's actually remarkable. The thought of Morel's lonesome cabin, sullen skin, and miserable energy crossed Vitala's mind, and she said, She doesn't seem the type to cause such a change. Don't let what happened in the town square fool you, Matthias said, leaning back in his chair with a sort of dark, ruminating look on his face. She used to be absolutely fearsome. My mother and father spent whole entire days praying for deliverance from her reign, for Krona to appear. I don't know if she was so much so fearsome as Reveldad was fearful, Saren said, a slight frown settling on his lips. The look he cast at Matthias gave Vitala the feeling that the two men had had past conversations that were in this exact same vein. Matthias made a gesture that conveyed the message of, "That's a fair point." There was a bit of silence after that. Vitala complimented Matthias on his cooking skills, which earned her a delighted look on his face. His natural expression, she realized, was one of worry and anxiety, so to see him give a genuine smile was a nice change of pace. "I take it you two are married?" Vitala asked, waving her fork between Saren and Matthias. Immediately, she could tell that this was probably not the best way to break the silence. Saren said yes to her, but afterwards cast another look at Matthias, who neither looked anxious or beaming, but rather uncomfortable. His eyes darted over to Vitala and then back at his plate where he stabbed at his food. She understood his discomfort at once, being far from a stranger to it herself. "You know," she began slowly, "a big part of the reason I came to Reveldad is because of how nicely homosexuals are treated here. When I was about 13, I remember asking my mother what age girls stopped pretending to find boys attractive, and the look on her face was—" Vitala shook her head and trailed off with a smile. The energy in the house took a dramatic shift. Vitala, Matthias, and Saren broke out into laughter. Josephine snorted, and Elias was either too young to understand what was funny or simply didn't care as he hopped up and down on his legs, which were folded under him, and took a hefty gulp of orange juice. As the laughter subsided, Vitala was happy to see Matthias relax in his chair. "I've never personally met Krona, but I owe her a lot," he said. "My devout mother and father had a far easier time accepting me because of her. Their exact words were, 'If God sent a homosexual to be our hero, then he can't hate them that much.' She was never shy about her sexuality, you know. I mean, Reveldad has always been progressive with those sorts of things, but she acts like she's not aware it's a thing people will judge her for, the way she pursues other women." He suddenly got an admiring look on his face. "Of course, my mother and father are still not—" He took a deep breath, as if he had begun saying something he wasn't sure he wanted to finish. "Happy with my marriage to Saren, but I have given them grandchildren, so they've got nothing to complain about there." Vitala took turns looking at Josephine and Elias. Elias was the winner in terms of who looked more like Matthias. It was almost spitting. He had Matthias's mouth, prominent ears, and kind face, but his hair was much curlier and his eyes slightly darker. Josephine only had her father's eyes. If it weren't for them, Vitala thought that she could pass as not being related to him at all. For fear of prying, Vitala did not ask the question that came to her mind. Instead, she said, "I've noticed Krona is quite revered." "Oh, very." Saren nodded. "The people of Reveldad praised her defeat of Morel 16 years ago." His lips twitched in a way that implied displeasure. Matthias noticed this and turned to Vitala to say, "Saren feels bad for the wool." "How could you not?" Saren asked in a soft voice, his eyes going noticeably dimmer. "She suffered more than any one creature should, drowning over and over again, becoming a leader at the age of only 11. 11? Vitala gawked at him. He nodded. "Her identity as the hero of the demons was discovered at an early age." "What about her parents?" "I assume that they're dead, though I've never asked her." "You've spoken to her before?" "A few times. Usually in passing. I can't tell if she dislikes me or just isn't one for conversation," Saren said gently, a humored twinkle in his eyes. "I can't figure it out myself." Vitala sighed solemnly. "Oh?" Saren regarded her with newfound interest. "You've spoken to her as well?" "Yes, she actually let me spend the night yesterday." She looked at Saren and Matthias to see if they'd judge her for keeping Morel's company, but their faces remained impassive, if not a little intrigued and surprised. But I'm not sure she liked me very much. I'm glad to know her demeanor stays consistent no matter what, Saren said, smiling in a bemused way. Can we stop talking about her? Elias suddenly whimpered. Vitala looked over at him to see he had become still and was pouting, looking displeased. She's really scary. How would you know? Josephine said, frowning at him. You weren't even born during her rule. Elias whipped his head around to look fiercely at her. Yeah, but Grandpa says she eats children who don't behave. She was in the square today, you know. Bet you didn't. He looked smugly at her, seemingly delighted to be privy to something she wasn't. Josephine looked at Saren for confirmation, as if Elias had a habit of lying about seeing Morel. When he nodded at his daughter, she simply grumbled and went back to her food. The rest of breakfast was spent in silence with a few scattered bits of conversation focused on innocuous topics. Elias asked no less than 10 questions about Willow and kicked his feet when Vitala happily provided him with answers. Matthias and Saren talked to each other about their day. Apparently Matthias found his favorite fruit at a great price. Saren talked about how the birdsong that morning had been so pleasing that he opted to listen to it instead of going back to bed. Matthias jested that Saren was an incurable early bird anyway. Josephine was, undoubtedly, the quietest of the bunch, not saying anything at all in fact, and Vitala couldn't help wondering if she was just being a typical grumpy teenager or if she was upset about something. Saren rising early to listen to the birds singing must have come back to bite him because he yawned deeply and stretched in his seat. Matthias looked at him with a loving smile on his face. He turned to Vitala then and asked, Have you had a chance to look at lodging arrangements, Miss Stone? No, she said, in the middle of wiping her mouth with a napkin. She eyed Matthias, wondering why he suddenly brought that up. I was planning on doing that today at some point. Matthias turned to Saren with an inquisitive look. Do you think Elaine would be inclined to give her a discount on a room if I tell her what she did for Arrow? Saren suddenly looked a little stiff, but he smiled anyway and gave a small nod. Most probably, especially if you mention how happy it made Elias. Whenever you're ready, Miss Stone, Matthias said. I saw that you had all your belongings on your horse and figured you might like to set them down in a safe space. I'd imagine your horse would like it too. Vitala, feeling just a tad bit sheepish, got up to go wash her plate. After that, she followed Matthias outside, readjusted the straps of her belongings on Willow, and let Matthias be her guide to whoever Elaine was. He led her to one of the inns that Reveldad had to offer. It was rather quaint, but looked as if it was newly built. He told her that the inn provided a section just for horses, but Porkchop could come inside with her. Once inside, Vitala found out who Elaine was. A short woman with a face that, oddly enough, rang a bell in Vitala's head even though she could swear that the two had never met. Elaine and Matthias were clearly of the same race, though she was a shade or two darker than him. Speaking of Matthias, the look on her face when she saw him was rather odd. It was like she was happy to see him, but would have preferred if he hadn't shown up unannounced. Elaine. Matthias greeted in a tone that would have been warm if not for the strange smile that accompanied it. Matthias. She greeted back with a similar air about her. The tension in the air made Vitala wonder why Matthias would suggest going to Elaine for a favor, as she did not seem the type to jump at the opportunity to provide him with such a thing. This is Vitala Stone. Matthias gestured to her. She was able to diagnose Arrow. I told you that she was sick, yes? Well, Miss Stone tells us that it's a common case of influenza. It made Elias very happy. I was wondering if you could provide her with a good deal on a room. Whatever odd energy she had towards Matthias was vanquished the moment he brought up the fact that Elias had been made happy by Vitala's actions. She beamed at her with a stunning warmth and said, Well, with a story like that, how could I not? Elaine pulled out a key that was dangling inside her shirt, yanked it off, and used it to unlock a drawer that Vitala could not see. After a moment or two of what sounded like metal clinking together, Elaine pulled out a separate key that was attached to a metal stub that read 313 and handed it over. "Third floor, Miss Stone. Great view, if I do say so myself." "Thank you," Vitala said, mouth slack as she could not believe the kindness that was being afforded to her. She paid what was due, bid Matthias and Elena goodbye, and then climbed the steps of the inn to find her room. The hall containing it was empty, though she did hear a few muffled voices. Her room was in the middle of the right side of the hall. The inside was small, but cozy looking, and even had a personal bathroom. There was a window that almost took up the entirety of the wall that was directly in front of her. It spilled vibrant sun rays into the room, which made the bed in the center look all the more warm and inviting. Vitala was sold. She went to flop face first onto the bed, but not before taking notice of the painting that hung behind it. It depicted a large body of water with what seemed to be a lighthouse in the background. The words, "She will win again," were brandished in golden letters at the very top. Vitala lay on her back, gazing up at the ceiling. Now that she had a moment to herself, the memory of Morel and the imp from earlier that day plagued her mind like it was the only thought she had in stock. She turned in bed, resting her head against her palm, but could not put her mind at ease. She wondered if Morel had anyone to check on her. What if she didn't and was left to deal with what had happened all by herself? Vitala picked up Porkchop, who had been laying at her feet, and held him to where he was hovering above her face. "What say you, Porky?" she asked him softly, looking into his black eyes. "How would you like paying another visit to Morel's cabin?" That is all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed, and thank you so much for listening.